We thought since everybody loves finishing early, we just do that and not. Also, we don't want to lose you when you go for your break. So we'll just move into our final session if we may. And those of you that are further back may wish to step, come forward if you wish to, because this is a audience participation segment of the program, even more so than up to now. What we huddled at lunch hour with our tireless planning committee and other people that were sitting at that table. So just again, Dina and Jennifer and Trevor and Amy Lynn and Scott Ratson, Kathy Taylor, Chris West. And in consultation, decided that what we tried to do is to brainstorm from among that group what were some of the key points that they recalled or that were most important to them. Try to now share those with you as a stimulus for you to tell us what are key points you want to make, what are ones that weren't made, things that were left out, things you want to argue with, and any actionable recommendations that you have from the last couple of days. And I'd say the reason the session is very important is that whatever we put together as public proceedings of these meetings has to be discussed here. So we can't go off, we're not going to go off and put something together. So this is your last opportunity on the record to really put on the table things that you really want to be sure are part of the proceedings and part of the work that's going to come out of this couple of days. So let me start by fearlessly reading these, understanding that it's just a stimulus to your input, and then John is going to manage the discussion. And of course, because we are taping, everything will be on the record as it has been up to now. So first of all, the purpose of the session was to highlight the key funding transitions going on in global health. The main initial focus was on the countries graduating out of international assistance and how both donors and countries are managing these transitions. But over the course of the workshop, we thought there were a number of things we learned. One was it was surprising to many how many transitions are going on at the same time, and that the risks of not planning or better coordinating these transitions among donors, within countries, and between donors and countries is significant. Second, another one is that the reminder from donors themselves that they need to think more about protecting vulnerable and marginal populations, especially in countries where there are political issues about specific populations such as LGBT populations, sex workers or others that have been sort of watched, if you will, by organizations like the Global Fund with HIV, and also some of the organizations that are critical in civil society to getting care to these individuals. It's also becoming more clear that there are important opportunities for the private sector, but also challenges. So with that said, as sort of starter points, here's a few sort of key takeaways. One is there are very different type of donors, different approaches to transition, and while all are concerned with not losing the gains that have been made, they have their own sort of constraints or ways of working. So the multilateral donors seem to be saying they have to make these transitions in a standard way. They don't have the time, if you will, to work individually to tailor every solution individually. Bilateral donors need to examine the basis on which they decide to continue to fund or shift their funding priorities to another area, such as diplomatic considerations we heard about, change in a focus on risk factors, geographic regions, and others. Those are points that are coming up. And then there's a question of the changing role of donors globally in general. Should they be looking more towards funding global public goods versus delivery of products, working with countries to define what that means? Is it procurement, fiscal infrastructure, digital infrastructure, as we've heard others? Shifting to another point, the SDGs and global donor agreements call for country-led solutions, but what does this really mean for the country? We explored this a good bit. Are donors really serious about country-led, and are they considering a bi-directional dialogue? And some other points made about having that dialogue and the sort of differences from country to country. Countries have different governmental structures, and who do you talk to? And that's an important thing to understand. Secondly, what do you talk about? Is it the objective burden of disease? Is it country priorities? Is it population areas. Who are the key actors? There are clearly multiple stakeholders: civil society, NGOs, academia, and how strong are they? How important a role do they play in that country's infrastructure? And then leading us inevitably to the question, what is the private sector? That it's important to identify and clarify that in country. Is it multinationals? Is it local small and medium enterprises? Is it other groups? Then we had a long discussion about the role of the private sector, questions sort of issues. How can the role of private sector organizations and private sector financing help to manage these transitions? And this includes financing and country capacity building to develop infrastructure and coordination. That in those conversations and decisions, we have to consider the principle of fairness in partnership. We heard models in the research community that may provide frameworks that can be adapted to public-private partnerships in other sectors in health. We need to look at the private sector operating in other sectors outside of health, where there may be funding, more funding, and there's a desire to steer towards health results, such as in transportation and housing and environment and energy. And that the private sector may need to start thinking of different ways of engaging than they have in the past. And I think our group here at this forum has repeatedly said it's not just about money, and we've heard that in the last day and a half, but it's also about know-how and knowledge transfer and bidirectional transfer, but what does that look like when you start to try to put it in place in a sustainable way? The next to final section was the tensions with private sector engagement, which were explored earlier today. Previous global meetings have called for the private sector to be involved, to bring their resources into global health. SDG 17 explicitly calls for private sector engagement, but we seem to be relitigating this issue again at global level with potential impact on donor behaviors and on countries, and this creates a tension that has to get addressed. And that there are types of companies. There are companies that do well, there's companies that do harm, and that there's companies that may do harm but want to make positive contributions, but it's very difficult to involve them if they are shut out from the initial conversation, and that how can we achieve more healthful changes if we can't develop those kinds of conversations and exchanges globally and at country level. And a real caution to public health leadership, governmental leadership, and civil society leadership around shutting out or stopping that kind of conversation. And then what about the future? Bringing up Gordie Howe, can we really look at donor behavior and funding and know-how contributions to where the puck is going versus where it is or has been? We need to consider NCDs, major problem, major cost, and burden of disease, but are not adequately funded. So as Johanna said, we're starting from nothing to do something, and this is a really important consideration. Need to look at the living and not just the dead, as Sir George said. If we only look at mortality, we're taking a model from infectious disease epidemics and applying it into a space that it no longer belongs. Even AIDS doesn't belong there anymore. It's largely a chronic disease, which is a great success story. We need to focus on primary care systems and prevention more than we have in the past. And how can we build more attention to these issues and build them into transitions? And one of our good quotes at the end, companies are predictable animals. Put a market in front of them and they'll run towards it. How do we create incentives that make the changes that we want to see made, rather than only trying to increase the market in the existing markets that really exist? So the next steps for the forum, we talked about a little bit. This group, I think, would advocate for a working group, as we've done in the past, to sort of take forward the incredibly rich conversations from this session. But we really do now want to hear your sort of key takeaways, key points, things that you haven't heard, things that you disagree with, and any actionable recommendations, so we can have them on the record. And Ambassador Lang, appropriately, as our diplomatic representative, will take this on. So okay. Hand it over to you.
Excellent summary there, Joe. Thank you. One correction, I think we were talking about Wayne Gretzky, not Gordie Howe.
Oh, sorry.
But other than
I used to live in Detroit.
Okay. Yeah, but Tim Evans is a Canadian.
Apologize
so.
to all Canadians.
Okay. Don't want to lose our Canadian friends. Okay. You heard from Joe our quick thoughts in terms of the summary, and open it up for others. First, let me look to our panel, the Planning Committee, and others on the forum itself. If you have any further thoughts that you'd like to add. Yes, Simon.
Thanks. Great job, Joe. That was terrific. Really helpful. Thanks. Just a couple of top takeaways from me. One was that importance of political will, and how do we foster that, nurture that, understand that, know that. And I think, Joe, you remember you led the work on this proposed framework for developing partnerships. I thought what we heard from Kenya yesterday about the SDG platform, public-private platform, and just finding ways of creating platforms for this space for negotiation, identification of markets, whatever. But I think that platform part is really part of that. I guess the next thing for me is really, well, I guess I want to build on that, which is, and what I was really encouraged to hear Peter talk about this morning as, sort of the partner of last resort. Matt, you're the last one. You're the last one there. The UN often is still there, and the UN is changing. It needs to change. And when Peter talked about the role of the resident coordinator, and so the role that SID is playing now is very different, I think, from a resident coordinator a few years ago, and it's going to change more and more rapidly. And the more that reform can build the capacity and knowledge and understanding of engaging with and helping governments and multiple stakeholders engage with the private sector, I think that's going to be an interesting dimension. So just from my world, I'm going to take that bit back. Thanks.
Thank you, Simon. Others? John? Oh, okay, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. I think that's a great summary of a very rich discussions since yesterday. So what I want to reemphasize, I talked about it before, was just the issue around sustainable solutions and the need to focus on the question of scale. I think that even here, within a lot of the discussions we have on PPPs, we get examples of what falls under the small, innovative, proof of concept, let's try this kind of partnership. And there are very many examples of all of those. I think it's time that we really looked at not the new, let's try this sexy sort of solutions, but focus on what is being taken to scale and what is transformative for our communities, because those are the true, proofs of concept that then need to be mirrored and expanded insofar as it is possible. So I just wanted to bring back that issue of the importance of focusing on the challenges of scale and what it is that we can do about it.
Thank you. John?
Sure. Just a couple things. I think one is what struck me is that in so many of the countries we heard about over the course of the 2 days, it's so clear that the public and private sectors and the NGO sector, broadly stated, are all struggling with these transitions differently given the incentives of their own, of what drives those organizations. And it strikes me it's going to be much more complex. I mean, this is just going to make things harder, not easier. I don't mean to, it's not an upbeat observation, but it makes the alignment of interests more necessary but challenging. Second, and this builds on Simon's point about platform, I worry that platform's now a metaphor in our head about what it means to negotiate across the sectors. And so I think getting closer to like if we think more public-private partnerships are warranted to address some of this, what does a negotiating platform, if you will, look like? And I think a third thing that I kept a number of times, it seemed to me there may be some common elements of an enabling or a favorable policy and regulatory environment that governments in multiple countries could address, particularly maybe around the introduction of products. And again, maybe this is something that the forum could look at. And then I think the last point is I was struck by the fact that so many of the donors who are in different stages of transition, it was not clear how much they were collaborating and coordinating with one another, and it seems like that presents an opportunity not only for them to learn from each other. I know there is hard work going on. I know where the colleague from the Global Fund is, but it also seems to me to be really helpful for the private sector if the donors were better engaged about how they're working together.
Thank you. Yes, Santiago.
Thank you, and thank you for a great workshop. My name is Niraj Mistry, and I've worked with many of the companies and organizations here. I have an observation, a comment, and a question. So 20 years ago, we were negotiating partnerships when I was at the Global Business Coalition on HIV, AIDS, TB, and malaria. And many of the themes came up then, and they're coming up today. What is significantly different, though, is the tone that we have and the relationship among the sectors. We're sitting here, we're quite accommodating and accepting and open to each other. Back in the day, there was this sort of ideological tension between the sectors. And I wondered, because that was the heyday when things like ACHAP and the Diflucan partnership at Global Fund and everything came about. So that tension is notably missing here. And I wonder how we can accelerate partnerships coming out of this, or whether that tension was important to keep each other accountable for the work that we do and push the bar forward with each other. The second is when we were at medical school, we used to have a joke that a patient comes in and you say, I can't treat your disease or manage you because I haven't read the chapter in the textbook. Which feels like what we're doing in global health. We've prioritized AIDS, TB, malaria, polio, the vaccines, and now we have NCDs, we have global mental health, we have re-emerging infections, syphilis is coming back, etc. But we have all these vertical structures, and the transitions we're thinking about are very much about vertical transitions for each of those particular institutions and disease areas. I think perhaps it's time now for a strategic transition on how we reimagine the global health world that then allows us for a financial transition to actually accommodate that. And we might be at an important pivotal point to actually enable that transition. Challenge becomes is who's on point to actually quarterback that type of response. And then my third point is, and to John's point, what is the platform? When everyone goes back, they go back to their day jobs, they have their key performance indicators and objectives. No one gets a chance to step back from their day job and conceptualize how all these things fit together. That used to be my job at the Global Business Coalition, so it was a dedicated function. But where is that platform today? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Niraj. Okay, let's go Scott first.
Thanks. I've been trying to give a lot of thought to put some of this in perspective, and Niraj just pointed some ideas, I guess, when I first, I guess it was 20 years ago when we were working in that activity. And I wouldn't say that the polarization is changed that much. And in fact, in some parts of the world, my observation is even more difficult as private sector than maybe it was a couple of decades ago. But my points I'd like to bring back, I think, to both the challenges we had yesterday and today. And it goes to who is the competent authority? Who is the competent authority at the end of the day to help make these regulatory hurdles easier? We know who those competent authorities are in a lot of countries, but what happens when you bring this public-private partnership together? Is it a recommendation from this group to be bigger and think wider and larger, or not? And I say this because in USAID days, I guess about 18 years ago, David, we were putting together the idea of a health competent society. And a health competent society included a lot of pieces, such as the ability to have a free press, such a functioning private sector, such as a platform or a place to have discussion. And that place it was on population and early HIV prevention and why you could introduce the idea of a condom as a disease prevention piece, not as only a family planning piece, all these things that we look at over time. So I'm taking that to where we are today. Where is, both what Neeraj and John well said, where's the platform? And then how do we create the opportunity for the competent authority perhaps to be this public-private partnership? And if that is the case, what are the rules? We can use the constructive ambiguity and diplomacy to develop that where it's appropriate at a global level, a regional level, a national level, and in some cases a subnational or local level. So I think what I'd like to talk about at future meetings is where are these principles or rules to help create this platform of a public-private partnership where appropriate parties perhaps can be engaged in the dialogue and perhaps leave if it's a policy decision, or perhaps engage appropriately if it's a policy decision where they could come up with a better innovative solution rather than being locked out of the room. And I say that I would hope that we would be able to think about it in different levels. There's places, obviously, with a multilateral member state organization, you might say, no, they have their rules, that's a member state organization. But what about these quasi-member state or mixed organizations, the Gavis, the global funds, the lesser extent UNAIDS, right, and so forth. So I think there's different levels that we ought to look at what those principles ought to be and what guidance can be given and what are the rules of engagement. And I'll just jump to one more piece and maybe come back to it. I think the digital, we need to think much bigger. We need to think about artificial intelligence. We need to think about the democratization. We need to figure out this device, if we can get over the privacy issues so we don't have what Ambassador Blick said. We're still paying Macro and PRB or whoever to do DHS for 40 years. Well, the data's there. We just figure out how to aggregate it differently and so forth. So there's some stuff that we could just think differently and bigger. I have some other ones, but we'll come back after maybe others.
Joe?
Yeah, I want to make one comment about the platform question, which has been discussed here previously. Not that it should end the discussion, but just to remind us, I think, because it was helpful. Part of the SDG piece that we put together emerged from a meeting that we had, where the Ugandan National Academy of Sciences, as a sort of neutral entity that, if you will, didn't necessarily have skin in the particular game, was trying to perform as a platform to really get civil society and government and the private sector to start talking to each other. I mean, and I think that spoke to just the state of conditions, which are going to vary from country to country. I mean, obviously we heard in Nigeria and others where it's very open. Kenya, it's an open conversation. It may not be as organized as it might be, but I think it's an interesting question: is can you have a global platform, or is it more of a country-specific or a regional-specific platform? I mean, those are really interesting questions, but I just wanted to remind us that we've had a little bit of that conversation here, which could certainly be expanded.
If I could just make one comment myself on this. Isn't universal health coverage the one thing that's a unifying focus, because it's fundamental to the SDGs? Dr. Tedros has made it fundamental. And it's not a platform, but it's a unifying thought, and the way, and many, we haven't really brought it up here so much, but many vertical programs feel it incumbent upon themselves to say how they're really strengthening health systems as part of their work because of that. Just a thought. Matthew.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one or two quick points. So we talked a lot about the kind of need to get all the actors engaged in these discussions, the need to plan in advance, the need to have fora to discuss them, and then the need to keep countries in the driver's seat. And I did just want to highlight that, at least from the Global Fund's perspective, we've built a lot of these things into the Global Fund model. So the Global Fund works closely with country coordinating mechanisms, stakeholders at the country level who submit requests for our financing. We finance national strategic plans that countries develop for their vision of how they'll finance and manage their national programs. And increasingly, we're working with countries to develop transition plans that look at a plan for this. And the reason I mention this, and I think it's important, is I think to the point that's been discussed multiple times, that at least from the Global Fund perspective, we're often one of the last donors in these. Getting more and different actors engaged in all of those processes is going to be really helpful for dealing with some of the gaps and making sure that those conversations in that whole model involve all different actors, so our traditional partners as well as the private sector. I think that's going to be really crucial to transition success. So I just wanted to highlight that. The other thing I just wanted to highlight really quickly, it didn't come up a lot at this forum, but I think it's something for this group to think about, is this idea of multiple transitions happening at the same time. There are definitely multiple transitions happening, but a little nuance in that conversation will be really helpful because, for example, the Gavi and Global Fund are broadly not transitioning at the same time. Gavi is transitioning out of countries much earlier than we are, and so there isn't that much overlap. So in that conversation, it's really less about transitions and more of changing financing trends. So if Global Fund allocations are going down, or if there is less external financing from multiple groups, and another donor is transitioning at the same time, that's really where we're going to see countries deal with challenges. So sometimes when we discuss multiple transitions, that gets lost a little bit. And I think Gavi and the Global Fund is actually quite a good example because, we are largely transitioning out of countries that Gavi has already transitioned out of. So just something for the group to think about.
Okay. Yes, Natasha?
Just a quick point to comment. Somebody commented earlier that when multilaterals are looking at transitions, that there's some pretty set policies on how to do that. And I think, but I think one thing to point out is that as we go through these transitions, we're also learning things, and many of us, claim and hopefully are learning organizations. And so I think the other point to raise is that it's important that we also remain somewhat flexible and are able to see issues coming down the road and potentially creating tailored approaches that really allow for the sustainable financial and programmatic transitions that we're all hoping to achieve.
Thank you. There was over there. Yes.
Husna Ali Khan from Pixera Global, based here in Washington, D.C., not to be confused with Pixar. So just, I guess, a little bit of food for thought. It's been wonderful hearing everything that you've shared over the past day and a half. At Pixera Global, we sort of live and breathe tri-sector partnerships. We sit firmly at the center of the public, private, and the social sector. And in terms of looking at innovative ways to partner, and it not just being about the financing and money, one of the practice areas that we have is global pro bono and pro bono consulting. So what my role is at Pixera Global is to try to encourage companies to think about how they're engaging their employees across business units to impact some of these things that I've been hearing in terms of the operational challenges that you face, especially in the Gavi presentation, learning about that transition year. How do you address the operational challenges? How do you approach working with the government in a sort of softer way with employees, and with the idea of engaging your own workforce in a sort of softer, co-creative method, the way that some of the universities are already doing. So just a little food for thought directly aimed at the private sector representatives here.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Nduku Kilonzo. So I think my one comment has to do with one of the issues that came up, and we didn't talk about it much. But as we have more partners crowding in, more private sector crowding in, more of the social enterprises crowding in, the role of government around regulation, around monitoring, around tracking performance, around accountability is something that cannot be understated or overemphasized, because then if we don't have that, what will happen is we'll have this influx that everybody is doing something and everything, but there is really no coherent results to show for it, and it will range in a very broad spectrum as far as quality is concerned. So I think that's one of the things that perhaps would be worth having a little bit more of a conversation about at some point.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Cara Bradley, Chief Corporate Engagement Officer at Path. Thank you for the last 2 days. It's been really interesting conversation. I think some of what I'm taking away from this is, as we talk about transitions, I think what comes to mind for me is the inherent connection with market building, and I'd be really interested to actually spend some more time and pushing this group and our communities to see what more we should be doing there. Particularly as it relates to capacity building. We spoke a little bit about this earlier. Something that I was struck with throughout this session is our global health space can be quite murky and difficult to understand from the outside, so can actually be quite challenging for private sector, non-traditional private sector outside of life sciences and commodities to engage. So I think that's another question we should be putting to ourselves.
Thank you.
John, do you mind if I just
Please go ahead.
one piece of the car? I think it's great on the market building, and I look over the one pharmaceutical member of our partnerships that are here. I think are left, and if you think of where we were 20 years ago on people that know their cholesterol level, and then all of a sudden they know their cholesterol level and statins showed up. I mean, you can see similar things with hepatitis. You can do similar things with a variety of other areas that are out there. There is a science to it, and there is a partnership model that could work very well if people would leave in some cases, the egos at the door or the competitive process at the door. And I know we've been talking about what you can learn from other sectors, and there is some early development where both pharmaceuticals and I know in the IT area, they actually could work through the intellectual property pieces and have faster gain if you can do it early and leave both egos and work through the IP piece. And let me just secondarily say not only market building, I think market maintenance, if there's a weird word to use for how we think about vaccines, but the vaccine hesitancy piece came up there, the challenge of political will or non-political will or the anti-vaccine movement. That will be, as that continues to gain, that will be the largest setback for a lot of public health gains we've had over the last generation. So as much as that could be fostered through different partnership models and potentially additive behavior, moving to routine when we're talking about the whole polio piece, but there wasn't really that kind of discussion of what, I'm talking about where the money was, not where maybe the health or global health need is. Just different ways of framing, and that I think is probably one of the pieces, if I could say, that's missing from our partnerships when we talk here, is we don't have the big C communication guys here, right? We have the intel inside, so to speak, but we're the people that are interrupting our life how many times a day. And it could be interrupting us with health messages, which is what we've tried to do, right? That was the hope. And now they're hazardous messages, right? Because they're interrupting us when we're supposed to be driving or walking across the street. So, it's a serious issue. I mean, I'm sort of glib, but yet I think the partnership piece could really be broad in that space. And if there are ways that we broaden, that's why I think what Clarence usually reminds me of is global health and safety. And some of those safety components are protecting the status quo in many of these markets.
Thank you. All right. I think we're about to come to a close. I'll turn it over to Joe in a second. But I would like to say, just from my own perspective, I think it's I've been following closely the polio transition and from a bit of a distance transitions at the Global Fund and Gavi and elsewhere. And to me, it was really striking to see it all together yesterday. That it just, as we said at the very beginning, there are a lot of changes coming in global health in this whole mix of international institutions, donors, et cetera, and how that's going to play out over the coming years. And yes, at a different pace. One of the paces we didn't talk about because Matthew's talking about the Global Fund and Gavi. The polio transition we don't really know because it all depends upon when the eradication of polio can be certified, and that's 3 years after the last case of wild polio virus transmission, and we're still having cases this year. So we don't know when that'll happen, but we know it's going to happen, and it'll be soon. And then today, from my perspective, it was really enlightening to hear a lot of different ways in which public-private partnerships can be creative, not filling the gap one-to-one, as we heard earlier, but making very important contributions. So I very much appreciate everyone's participation in this. The Planning Committee was terrific in what they all did. And I won't mention the whole committee again because I think we've mentioned you a few times. But I do want to mention Katie, Priyanka, and Rachel, who put in huge amounts of work to put this together. It's not easy to have people flying in from all over the world and to organize it well and so smoothly as this was. So thank you for my part, and here's Joe.
Just to reinforce what John said, and thanks for those that he thanked already. It was an incredibly rich discussion. I think the evolution of this group, in a sense, sort of a sign of its maturity and trust levels, moving towards some of the points that the opportunities we have here in this forum are reflected by the increasing diversity of those coming to the table and being involved in our conversations, from countries, from civil society, from government, and from the private sector, and it's very exciting. I think maybe we're getting towards a microcosm of the future, and we just have to keep it up and see how we can really take on these challenges. And I can't think of a better group to keep moving the ball forward. We look forward to having you join us in the future. So thank you all very much.